Welcome to another edition of Give Me an Answer. Thanks for tuning in. We have an exciting one this afternoon with prolific author, apologist. He was at RZIM, a leader in many different ways, Andy Bannister. Check out his links that we'll have below on social media. And we're going to talk about some of his debates today and also some of his new books. His most recent one, out on whether Muslims and Christians worship the same God. We also love the title of a few books ago, Andy, the one on the atheist that never existed. A lot of wit in there, razor sharp, there it is. And Heroes is another one, as well as one of your latest on the coronavirus. So welcome to the show. Great to have you.
It's great to be on, gentlemen. Thanks for having me on, especially after I gather that last night you were debating atheists till almost midnight. So I'm really glad that you're still standing with energy for another show.
Sure. So give us a little bit on your most recent book and maybe on Heroes too. I found the heroes that you chose, those were very interesting ones. I mean, Wilberforce, Tim Keller, and others, obviously C.S. Lewis. So give us a little bit on your latest book.
Yeah, so the latest book, and it is literally, the manuscript went to the publisher this morning, but it won't hit the streets until March, and that's called Do Muslims and Christians Worship the Same God? And so I'm unusual as a kind of Christian theologian, philosopher, and sort of jobbing apologist, in that my PhD is actually in Islamic studies. And so I've had lots of conversations with Muslims over the years, talk about that topic a lot. And, that question comes up a lot. I think so many people assume that the God of the Quran, God of the Bible is the same, that, Islam is an Abrahamic faith, just like Christianity and Judaism. And so I've been talking about that, lecturing, speaking on that for years. And I felt the need to do another book after the kind of bright red one. And so we've gone for that one. So that is the book, and it's a lot of fun. I mean, it dresses, as well as Islam and Christianity, there's lots of stuff on there, and pluralism, other religions, and how we navigate the kind of pluralistic world we live in, and hopefully it's very Christ-centered as well, and really sets forth what's unique about Jesus. So yeah, I've really enjoyed writing it. It took the last year to write that, and as I say, that's coming out with IVP in March. So kind of watch this space.
That's fantastic. Now, the atheists that never existed, didn't exist. Do atheists really exist? Because I hear, when we had Julian Baggini on, he kept using the word faith and belief quite a bit, even in regards to his atheism. And yet last night, when we had some new atheists on, they wanted to chop our heads off whenever we talked about belief or faith, and that they were particularly religious.
Oh, yeah. They don't like it. It's interesting. But I'm always reminded, whenever I hear some of the new atheists talk about faith and belief and ridicule it, I'm always reminded of that line in The Princess Bride, about, you keep on using that word, but I do not think it means what you think it means. And what I like about I think far more thoughtful atheists. I mean, you had one of the kind of new atheist kind of sort of gunslingers on, I recall you said last night, but I think more thoughtful, thought through, more intellectually rigorous atheists, to be frank, people like Julian Baggini, Michael Ruse, there are others, I could name. I think they are very, very open to the fact that what they have is a belief system. They have a worldview. John Gray would be another example. British atheist, wrote a book last year, I think, 7 Types of Atheism. And in fact, he has a real go at the new atheists who kind of think that they have nothing to defend. And so, yeah, the joke in the title, actually, the funny thing is, I wasn't going to call the book what it ended up getting called. I wanted to call it Why Sweden Doesn't Exist and Other Problems for Atheism. But the publisher said, no, that's too off the wall. They won't get it, especially those Americans and stuff. So they suggested this title, and it comes from the chapter in here looking at science. Stuart, I deal with some of the really extreme end of atheism, who basically don't think consciousness exists, that mind is just atoms and particles. And the problem is, if you push that materialism too far, you end up not only explaining God away, you actually end up explaining human beings away. And in fact, I think actually, as the atheist philosopher Mary Midgley once said, it's all very well to sort of argue God out of existence. It looks rather embarrassing to argue yourself out of existence. I paraphrase her. And so I came up with that idea, the atheist didn't exist, that actually some forms of atheism, without realizing it, our atheist friends have literally thrown themselves out of the window along with God. They haven't thought about where their arguments actually end up, and that's what I do in the book, basically, is take 10 or I think 11 common new atheist arguments and just really show what happens if you just push them to their logical conclusion and do it in sort of fun, amusing way, and have some fun with it along the way.
That's great. So the debate last night, oddly enough, I love this is kind of a God moment here. It's not just a coincidence that you brought up kind of the consciousness piece, because the debate topic last night was on the immaterial soul. And I love that you've written about the consciousness piece. So how do you think through the immaterial soul, atheists were really trying to get on us in terms of, obviously, there's no divine creator and there's no immaterial soul. And, you know, they kind of went towards consciousness, but we were trying to steer more so towards, biblically speaking, theologically and psychologically. And they were going more philosophically in terms of, you know, emergence, dualism, and all these other things. How do you think through the immaterial soul, and how is consciousness connected to it?
Yeah. Well, I think obviously as Christians, I think obviously we're on very good biblical grounds with the immaterial soul. There is something, there is obviously a physical component to us, but there is a non-physical component too. You know, in the creation account, when sort of God breathes his spirit into us and the first man became a living being. What's interesting then, of course, I find it fascinating that most of my atheist friends and people I've talked to over the years do actually begrudgingly admit there is something different and unique about human beings. I mean, most atheists I meet believe in human rights, for example. They believe we have dignity and value. They believe there's been something different done. You know, there's a moral difference between, you know, killing an animal, or certainly an insect, and a human being. And it's interesting, Peter Singer, who we talked about before the show, very well-known atheist ethicist who I debated a couple of years ago. You know, he started out in our debate sort of saying he didn't believe in human rights, and by the end he was saying he thought moral values really existed. So I don't think you can kind of get around the fact there is something unique about human beings. But coming at it from the other end, I think a nice way into that with my secular friends is the consciousness argument, because to go, look, if mind and consciousness exist, then we have an obvious immaterial part of us, and I think that coheres quite nicely with the Christian doctrine of the immaterial soul. Quite how they fit together, that's a fascinating topic to argue about and discuss as theologians and philosophers, but that there is an immaterial part. In a nutshell, I think it becomes very difficult to explain consciousness purely in material terms. Actually, another atheist, I've never dialogued with him, but I admire his writings tremendously, Raymond Tallis, who is a British atheist and philosopher and neuroscientist, wrote a wonderful book a few years ago called Aping Mankind, Neurophilia, Darwinitis, and the Reduction of Humanity. And it is a absolutely fantastic, full, all guns blazing attack on materialism. And he is convinced that materialism utterly cannot explain the mind and consciousness. It is totally useless. And the fun thing is, it's about 500 pages of book. It reads brilliantly. And as you work your way through it, you're like, this is great. This is fantastic. What's he going to put into the place of materialism? As the pages that you've read get more and more and more, the pages left to go get thinner and thinner and thinner. You're like, come on, Raymond, where's the rabbit that you're going to bring from that? And the depressing thing is there is no rabbit. Basically, the book is an argument that says it's not materialism, but I don't know what it is. But it's a brilliant hatchet job on materialism, because I think trying to reduce mind to just matter doesn't work. And it's interesting, I don't know whether you said your friends last night brought up dualism. You know, many atheists I meet run a mile from any form of dualism, because that again is a foot in the door, because the moment you have, you know, two kinds of stuff. And in fact, what's interesting, Raymond Tallis talks about the fact you can't get away from dualism. He says even people who just try and be materialists have to admit there are two types of matter in the universe. There is matter that thinks, which is what goes on up here, and every other piece of matter in the universe doesn't. So we've now got a dualism. We've got two things. He says you cannot get away from it, that there is something utterly unique about what's going on up here. And so, yeah, I think the argument from consciousness, and we can talk more about it if you want to, I think it's actually one of the most powerful apologetic arguments. It's a bit complex to navigate through. So I know for some people, they kind of shy away from it. But I've always quite enjoyed it. And so there's some great books out there that have been written on it.
It's great.
Andy, how do you think through interpreting the Old Testament? Specifically, what about the different literary styles in the Old Testament? I guess even more specifically, how much of Genesis 1 to 11 do you take as historical? How much of Job and Jonah do you take as historical? And if so, or if not, why? What are the tests that you use to determine historicity?
My word, Cliff, I love that you sat there silent through consciousness. Now you just come out with a humdinger or a theological question. Yeah, brilliant question. And the first thing I want to say is I think so often, I think as Christians, we often neglect the Old Testament because we're a bit afraid about it, because it is some of the harder material in the Bible to interpret. One reason, of course, for that being that we are so far separated from it in time and culture and language and everything else. I mean, yes, we're 2,000 years separated from the Gospels, more or less, but actually, particularly in the West, there is a very good degree of continuity. You know, the West has grown out of the Greco-Roman tradition, so actually, it's easier in some places than elsewhere. So, in terms of the Old Testament, what I would say I do is the first thing, obviously, I want to try and do is try and understand the genre that's going on. I think that should always be one of our questions when we're reading any text in Scripture, especially the Old Testament. And of course, there's no problem at all for a Christian understanding of having a high view of Scripture, with the idea that God inspired the human authors to write a whole variety of genres. I think it's phenomenal. And actually, particularly as my academic background is Quranic studies. I compare the Quran and go, gee whiz, the Quran is monogenre, and that creates all kinds of problems for Islam, because it's generally read in a very wooden, very literalistic way. Christians were not committed to that. It's entirely obvious that parts of the Old Testament are poetry. It's entirely obvious that parts of the New Testament are parable, and so on and so forth. Where the challenge comes is exactly the books that you've gone for, and one or two other places where sometimes the genre isn't clear. So let's start with Genesis. I mean, you asked it in a slightly loaded way, if I'm going to be cheeky, and said, do you think it's historical or not? Even what we mean by historical, there are different layers of historicity. There is, simply recording sort of dates and names and facts in a kind of list type form. We might have genealogy, for example. Then there is straightforward historical reportage. And then there's doing what I think, where I would tend to land on Genesis, which is trying to describe sort of prehistory and that great God's work of creation that takes place even before recorded history begins, in a way that can both be understood by the ancient Israelites and can mean something to us today. So I suppose if you want to nail me down on Genesis, I lean towards, I suppose, what would classically be called a kind of framework position. I've been influenced quite a lot by people like John Walton, his book, The Lost World of Genesis 1 through 3, where I think he would say Genesis 1 through 3 is not written to answer the kind of questions that we ask today. It's not written to answer scientific questions. It's far more designed to answer the question, who is God? Who are we? And what's gone wrong in that relationship? Those are its primary questions. Also, quite a lot in there about Sabbath, actually, because if you a lot of the Old Testament is written to answer the questions about the way the universe is ordered in terms of time and structure and chronology and calendar, and there's been a lot of really good work done on that of late, looking at Genesis in its kind of liturgical setting. So I want to take the text very seriously, and I want to do the work to figure out what's going on. In terms of Job and Jonah, interesting, right? I mean, Jonah, you've got one of the oldest books in the whole of the Old Testament. Actually, the experts tell me. I'm not an Old Testament expert. I tend to, from the sort of genre clues and the stuff that I've read, put Jonah into the historical end very much so. Interestingly, as someone with an interest in Islam and someone who's traveled in the Middle East, the traditions about what Jonah did in that part of the world, you talk to people in that part of the world, they are very convinced that's historical. The Iraqis are very kind of sort of proud that they've got connections. Nineveh is in modern day Iraq, and there are Iraqi Christians who consider that very much an exciting thing, that the Bible is talking about their country, and their memories are very long in the Middle East. Job, for me personally, the jury is still out on. It's structured almost like a play, isn't it? Actually, in terms of the different characters in there, it's clearly designed to make a primarily a theological point about how we live with suffering. And I'm going to, maybe I'm going to shock you or shock a few listeners are going, I think in the case of Job, I don't think it changes one way or the other whether Job is historical or he isn't. I think there are, a few implications flow from there, but I think the primary message that comes out is the same either way. And I want to read as faithful as I can to the text. So I think on Job, I would say I'm not wholly committed. I probably lean towards historicity. But if you could prove to me that it wasn't, I wouldn't go, well, that's game over. I guess I'm going to go and become a new atheist. I hope that sort of helps. I'm rambling my way through that. I'm not an Old Testament expert. Right. I'm just who reads widely and tries to keep an open mind where I can and do the best I can.
All right. Do Christians and Muslims worship the same God?
Well, it's funny. It's interesting you asked that. When I told people I was writing on that book, a number of people who wrote back and said, what's the one-word answer? How are you going to, that's not going to sell books? And I said, yeah. I said, I wrote the answer in one word. So my editor said, no, I want another 499,999 words. Let me unpack that for you. I think the answer is both yes and no. I'll have some fun with you. I think the reason being, it's a slightly slippery question. And let me explain what I mean by that. Some questions, we sometimes try and make do too much work. Good example, I have a 5-year-old son who, if we're very unlucky, will come crashing through the door at some point and gate crash our podcast. And one of Christopher's favourite games, my 5-year-old son, he loves that that old parlour game, Animal, Vegetable, or Mineral, right? You all know that game where you think of it, you got to think of something, and the very first question is Animal, Vegetable, Mineral, and then you have to try and, using yes or no answers, figure out what's being thought of. Well, my son, as soon as he's figured out the answer that you're thinking of animal, likes to go right to the hyper-specific. Is it a European lesser-striped swallow? He jumps straight to the specific before filling in the detail. And I think we're doing the same thing with, do Muslims and Christians worship the same God? We're trying to make that question do too much. We need to fill in some detail. And what we need to do is break it apart. And I think that there are two aspects to the question, Cliff. We can ask this question: does the Quran describe the same God as the God of the Bible? That's the first question, to which I think the answer there is a categorical no. When we look at the Bible, there are a number of attributes, characteristics, I think, of Yahweh, the God of the Bible. He's a God who's relational. He walks and talks in the garden with Adam and Eve. He appears to Abraham. He appears to Moses at the burning bush. He appears in numerous theophanies to his people throughout the Old Testament, as well as being with them in the wilderness and the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire. In Jesus, of course, he steps into history. And in Revelation chapter 21, he's going to dwell with his people again. He's a relational God. He's a God who can be known. Time and time again, the Bible invites readers not just to know about him, but to know him personally. That's the repeated invitation of the Bible. He's a God who is holy. That point is made time and time again. God is not just a God who sort of somehow disapproves of naughty deeds and wants to ding us around the ear. He's a God who is so holy, so righteous, so pure, he can't even tolerate sin in his presence, which sets up a number of other themes in Scripture. He's a God who is love. Letter to 1 John says that God is love, and that theme is all over Scripture. And he's a God who's expressed that love through suffering. He's particularly, of course, in the cross and the atonement. And we could flesh all that out if we had more time. So those 5 characteristics, I think, are central to the identity of the God of the Bible. Turn to the Quran, and every single one of them is either denied or twisted 180 degrees. Allah is not a relational God. In fact, the Quran borrows various biblical stories that have relationality at their heart and just rewrites them to remove it. God cannot be known in the Quran. The Quran is categorically clear that you cannot know Allah. You can know his commands, yes, but not him. He's not a God who's holy, actually. That is never a characteristic applied to Yahweh, to Allah in the Quran. Power is the main attribute rather than the holiness, actually. That Allah is the one who has the power to set the rules, and so he does. Allah is not a God who's described as a God of love in the Quran. In fact, the Arabic word for love that's used in a few places, many Arabists will tell you that word is better translated like. Allah approves of certain people, disapproves of others, but love is not really there in the Quran. And he's certainly not a God who has suffered in any shape or form. He's utterly immutable, to use the term, and it's considered blasphemy by Islamic theologians to suggest otherwise. And you set those characteristics up and you go, this is quite simply not the same God we're talking about here. That's the Quran and the Bible. That's the no part of the question, Cliff. The yes part is, I do meet Muslims, many Muslims over the years, who I do think are seeking after the God of the Bible. Famous example, dear friend of mine, died a few years ago now, Nabil Qureshi, whose book Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, known by many people. As a young Muslim, I think he would say he was desperately seeking the God of the Bible, or he just didn't know it. He wanted a God who was love. He wanted a deep relationship with God, and really couldn't find it in Islam. And he reminded me actually of that passage in Acts 17 where Paul is in Athens and comes across the altars of the unknown God and does this beautiful sermon and preach to the Athenians, pointing out that what they are seeking as unknown is the God who's actually revealed himself in Jesus, and he connects the two. I think that's going on in the case of many Muslims. I want to give you one more story. I remember a couple of years ago doing a big university event at the university here in Scotland. About 200 people there that night, Q&A evening. So people had brought their friends. There was dessert and coffee and so forth. And my friend and I sat on bar stools in front of the auditorium and answered every conceivable question for 2 hours. And at the end of the evening, a young student came up to us to have a chat, introduced himself, said he was a Muslim, and I was kind of waiting for the tough question. He said, I've come up this evening because I would just ask I'd be interested in asking whether you and your colleague would consider praying for me. And we said, sure, how can we pray for you? He said, well, for over the last year or so, I've been putting Islam to the test and reading lots and investigating. I've already been doing the same for Christianity. I'm coming more and more to the conclusion that Jesus was who Christians claim he is, the Bible says he is, and that Christianity is true, Islam isn't. He said, I'm not quite there yet, but I'm coming closer. He said, but if I take these last few steps, there are some big implications. Big implications. Family, he said, I'm sure you know this. He said, would you gentlemen just pray with me that I have the courage to follow where I think God is leading me, because I'm afraid. And so we just had the honor of praying with him. There was a Muslim who I think was seeking the God of the Bible. So I think some Muslims are worshipping the God of the Bible and reaching out towards him. And wonderfully, he's reaching down to them. The God of the Quran is not the God of the Bible. And that's so nothing but confusion over 1400 years. Long answer, but great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Someone should write a book on that.
So we know Miroslav Volf pretty well, who I know is not a tough theologian. And it's interesting how you brought up Nabil, because I know they had a debate. I don't know how many years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. Maybe.
Miroslav's not going to like me.
What? He's been writing you.
Wolf is at the door, but there we are. So,
so kind of, I know his book was Allah. How do you? We love when he talks to us about forgiveness, judgment. That's tremendously helpful, and I'm able to use that in some of our debates and just conversations. We're both pastors as well, and it's so I love his work there. But to your point, why does he kind of conflate the two? And why do, obviously in our pluralistic culture that's pretty politically correct, and perhaps the love ethic is seeping in there in a way that's just confusing things. How do people just, again, get God the Father? How do they get it so mixed up? And it was interesting how you said it's yes and no. But when you did say the yes, it's more so because they've been searching for God the Father in the Christian faith. So how has Miroslav kind of gone a little bit in the wrong direction, potentially there? And what would you say to him?
Well, it's funny you say that, because I had exactly the same kind of response really to you folks, because I loved his earlier work, Exclusion and Embrace, his work on forgiveness, just utterly brilliant. I think the clue when you read his book, Allah, A Christian Response, comes at the beginning when he does the kind of autobiographical part. If you recall, he tells about how he grew up in the Balkans, a very, very fractured part of Eastern Europe where people have been, fighting for centuries, and the countries have been fractured to some degree along religious lines, with Muslims and Christians divided and killing one another tragically. And so Miroslav has this great heart, as you say, for forgiveness, reconciliation, seeing people come together. And so he gets it into his skull that the way to do that is to affirm that we worship the same God. He talks about the fact, if we just recognize we worship the same God, then, that's going to bring some peace and some harmony and some unity. Now, that's a laudable motive to bring peace and harmony and unity. I just would want to put it to Miroslav that his entire project is flawed from the get-go. Firstly, I don't believe we have to believe in the same God to be friends. I mean, you had a vociferous atheist on your show last night, Aaron Ra, who did not believe in God. You guys clearly do not believe in the same God. But I'd hope to think when the mics stopped and the rhetoric went, if he turned around, if he was in the room with you and went, hey, should we go out for a curry? You'd have gone, yeah, that'd be great. And you could actually be friends, and you wouldn't need to believe in the same God. I have plenty of atheist friends who I don't believe in the same God, but I don't feel the need to kill them. They annoy me and I annoy them, but that's as far as it goes. My Hindu friends, I have Hindu friends, clearly don't believe in the same God. Buddhist friends don't believe in the same God. If Miroslav is right, we're toast. We can't be friends because we can't affirm the same God. And of course, the other problem for Miroslav, Sunnis and Shiites, who've been at each other's throats since the 600s, when there was that civil war broke out in Islam. They do believe in the same God, and it's been a bloody history for sort of 1400 years. So I think the whole framing is wrong. And that framing then sets up the way he reads the Quran, because Miroslav then comes to the Quran desperately looking for ways to bring together. And I think he utterly misreads the text. I'm a Quranic specialist. That's my training. And there's places where he reads the text. I'm like, what are you doing to the Quran, buddy? You are literally twisting the meaning of the text to make it work. A classic example of that would be that the way that Miroslav struggles with the fact that the Quran doesn't talk about love. So if you remember, he does this little exegetical game where he says, well, you know what? Mercy is the same as love, effectively. So whenever the Quran talks about mercy, it means love. Well, firstly, I'd say to Miroslav, the word love does appear in the Quran in just a few places. And there's a big debate about whether it means actually love or it means like. But the Arabic term is there. He just rather ignored it. The other problem is that mercy is not equivalent to love. The example I use in the forthcoming book is that, we live on the edge of a town. We've got fields out the back of the house because I have the countryside, and that's great. But it does mean occasionally you get little furry visitors coming to the garage. And I did originally get, the kind of cheap mouse traps that, send the mouse to the great cheese factory in the sky. And the smaller members of my household put up a massive resistance that I was committing genocide against the kingdom of mice. And so we invested in humane mouse traps. Humane mouse traps are brilliant because they're these little tubes. You catch the mouse, you can release it in the field, and the next day it comes back again. It's like the Great Escape in reverse. But I showed mercy to the mouse by not killing it. I don't love the mouse. I don't want any kind of relationship with the mouse. I just want the darn thing to leave. But trust me, I don't love the thing. Mercy is not the same as love. You can show mercy without love coming into the equation at all. I think Miroslav gets very confused. I think the other thing as well he's done, again, because he's desperate to find harmony, most of the Islamic voices he interacts with in the book are at the Sufi end of Islam. That's the more mystical end of Islam. He largely ignores the mainstream Sunni and to a lesser extent Shiite tradition and goes for the kind of cuddly sort of Sufis who love to hug anything and anybody. And they're lovely. I love talking to Sufis, but, dealing with them is a bit like nailing fog to the wall. And so I think all of that skewed the book. One other thing I'll just throw in, and we can follow this lead if you want, or we can move on. The other thing I think he has utterly missed, and there's been great work done of this of late by more recent scholars than he was writing. There's a much greater consensus now, I think, among critical scholars of Islam that Islam is not even a sister religion to Judaism and Christianity. It's obvious when you think about it. It grows up in Arabia, over 1,000 miles from where the action in the New Testament takes place. The first Christians were all Jewish, which explains the connection, there, aside from the fact that, God was breathing those two scriptures together. But the Quran, different context, different country, different people group. And sure, it's borrowed some terms from Judaism and Christianity, but the underlying theology is totally different. And there's a wonderful Australian scholar called Mark Dury, who's written recently a big fat book on the Quran that I did see on my shelf somewhere. I would wave at it if I can see it, but it's gone wandering. And Mark's book on the Genesis of Islamic Genesis, I think it's called, or something like that. It's a really good study on the sort of Arabic substrate of the Quran and to Islam. And that's not to denigrate Islam. If anything, quite the opposite. It's to say we need to understand it as an Arabian religion with that kind of background, not to get misled just because there are some words and some names in there that we recognize. But Miroslav, I think, misses all of that and assumes that Islam is part of the wider Judeo-Christian family. So yeah, lovely man. I have so much respect for him. I've deeply, deeply admired his writing over the years. But that book, boy, that was a doozy.
Now, in your new book, are you going to touch on Islam and violence or killing of the infidel? Because a lot of when we have Muslims come speak at our church, for example, a lot of them are very kind of liberal, and they'll say that's all spiritual warfare. It's not physical. But then I'll have other Muslims say, no, if you actually took the Quran literally, we are supposed to go kill the infidel. And I'm not sure if you remember that tragic, gosh, the video that went viral on CNN. I want to say it was about 4 or 5 years ago, of that mentally ill woman who, I think it was even by accident, lit a Quran on fire, and the entire village of thousands of people chased her up on top of a rooftop. They went up there, threw her off the rooftop, and then beat her to death. And this viral video was shown on CNN. So do you, in the new book, are you going to kind of talk about violence? I know it's a tricky one to talk about, but how do you work through that one?
In terms of it, are we going to talk about it in the book? No, simply because I think I wanted to keep the book very narrowly focused on that one kind of question, things directly related off it. But I'm very happy to talk about the question. I think the interesting thing is this, that I'm absolutely aware that Muslims, particularly the kind of Muslims that we may engage with in dialogue here in the West, tend to be more moderate and tend to kind of disavow that, and actually maybe even quite nervous about those texts themselves. And not least because, of course, the fact we have, people who can be, there are people in our societies who are verging on the Islamophobic, who will love to take those texts, wave them around, and use them to demonize Muslims. So the whole thing is very messy. The other thing that makes it very messy is the Quran contains violent verses. Surah 9 verse 5, fight against the infidel wherever you find them and lie in wait for them and strike off the heads of them and so on and so forth. But it also contains peaceful verses like Surah 2:5-6, which talks about there being no compulsion in religion. Truth stands out clearly from error. In other words, it seems to say live and let live. God will figure it out in the end. So how do we navigate through that? Well, the way we navigate through that, according to traditional Islamic theology, is that Islamic theology since the beginning has generally taken the line of saying where we have two verses or passages or sections of the Quran that appear to contradict each other, the way we navigate through them is we figure out which was revealed later in Muhammad's life and which came earlier. And we use the biography of Muhammad to kind of sort the Quran into some kind of chronological order. And then we can appeal to something that's become known as the doctrine of abrogation, which is later verses supersede or abrogate earlier ones. That's based upon a verse in the Quran that introduces that idea. Well, what becomes interesting then, when you line those verses up, of course, if you know anything about the biography of Muhammad, he moved from peace and tolerance, because he was a small minority, actually, in Mecca in the first half of his career, to using force and violence and jihad in the second half of his career up in Mecca. And most of the more how should we say, fruity verses in the Quran come from that latter section of Muhammad's life. And that gives you a real difficulty if you're a moderate Muslim, because of course the other difficulty is exactly there. Muhammad moves from peace to violence. You are faced with the fact that Muhammad was a warrior. And I always be very careful here and say to Christians, let's not demonize Muhammad. Let's tell the truth. Let's be honest. But at the risk of still nevertheless causing controversy, I would tend to want to bracket Muhammad more with people like Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, great strategists, military leaders of men who made an amazing impact and did amazing stuff. But boy, I wouldn't want to follow them as an example today. I'm glad they're back there in history. We don't need to demonize, but we can leave people in history. The other problem, of course, for moderate Muslims who want to ignore this stuff, if you look at Muhammad's companions, and those who set up the Muslim community after his death, those early Muslims, what do? They launched the great expansion of Islam out of Arabia and across North Africa into Asia and beyond. They built one of the world's great empires. Everyone goes on about the imperialism of the UK, the British Empire and stuff. We were terrible, right? I mean, someone said the sun never set on the British Empire because not even God would trust us in the dark. But thank you for laughing at that terrible joke. But Islam had a great empire as well. And so those first Muslims, those early caliphs who led Islam after Muhammad, what were they thinking? One would presume they knew what their leader, their prophet, would have thought. Presumably they didn't go, hey, the guy's a pacifist, but he's dead, so let's go conquering. I think it's more likely, when you look at Muhammad's actions in the last part of his life and what happened next, that he was very much of the view that violence is okay. And it's interesting, of course, that Muslims often tell you that Islam means peace. But of course, it doesn't. The Arabic word Islam means submission. And the other historical parallel I point out here, it's interesting. The Roman Empire, the Romans who went around conquering everything that moved, they talked about peace. They talked about the Pax Romana, which was the peace of Rome that came when they had conquered everything. There were no enemies. There would be peace. because there would be no conflict. I think Islamic theology in its early days was working on a similar framework. Muhammad's view and those who followed him was, yes, of course there can be peace when people have submitted to Islam and there is no resistance. Now we need to use that carefully with our Muslim friends. Many of our Muslim friends won't have been aware of that. The last thing I want to do is see that kind of material weaponized and used to ding Muslims around the ears. I'm a great believer in asking questions. So when I talk to Muslims, I often love to raise this stuff and say, tell me how you deal with this. How do you deal with those conquests in the early years of Islam? Was that Islamic? Did they all get it wrong? If they all get it wrong, why did they get it wrong? And so forth. Ask good questions and obviously take every opportunity to point to Jesus, who is the Prince of Peace. And that's always the gospel connection. Rather than get superior, is to go, look, I think the human heart is wicked above all things, and all of us are inclined to violence, given the opportunity. But that's why we follow the Prince of Peace, the one who can actually repair our hearts and mend our hearts and give us the power to live differently. Muhammad was no worse than you or I. He just had more opportunities to use power than you or I did. Only Jesus can change human hearts, yours, mine, and if only Muhammad had met him before it was too late.
Amen.
How do you respond to the Muslims who say Jesus never claimed to be God?
Oh, that is in the book, Cliff. That is a whole chapter in the book on that. I love that. I love that question. And in fact, we talked about feisty atheists and friendly atheists and feisty Muslims and friendly Muslims. One of the friendly Muslim debaters, I love debating him. There is a wonderful Muslim cleric apologist called Shabir Ali, based up in Canada, one of the Muslim world's most well-known debaters. I've debated 3 or 4 times with Shabir. Now, really nice guy. Fiery and robust, but really nice guy, and a real proof you don't need to believe the same thing to get on well. And he and I did a debate in Toronto on this very topic about 3 years ago. And the approach I took there is the same approach I took in the chapter. I actually begin outside the Bible. I begin in early history, and I go, it's interesting when you look in early church history, 1st century, 2nd century, 3rd century, every Christian group that we know of worship Jesus. Even the heretical ones, even the fruit and nut end of the Christian spectrum worship Jesus, which is interesting. If you look at the New Testament, the latest books in the New Testament, take the book of Revelation, which is probably the last book in the canon. Jesus claims to be the Alpha and the Omega. He receives worship. That he's portrayed as a lamb slain on the throne of God, and so on and so forth. Go back down through the New Testament in chronological order backwards. In every book of the New Testament, Jesus is worshipped. He receives praise. People pray in his name. They cast out demons in his name. They baptize in his name. People call upon the name of the Lord. And in the New Testament, that means Jesus. In the Old Testament, it meant Yahweh. We get amazing early Christian hymns like Philippians 2, dating probably to the early 40s. Where that adopts the language of Isaiah, talking about every knee bowing and every tongue confessing that Yahweh is Lord, applies it to Jesus. On and on it goes. So the worship of Jesus is all over the New Testament, all over early Christian history. And of course, the Romans, interestingly, when they were persecuting the early Christians, they worked this out. And the test of whether you were a true Christian was, they would force you to worship Caesar instead of Jesus. And if you refused to do that, they killed you. So the enemies of the church had worked out worship was the key. Now, this is where things get interesting. Worship was in Judaism, and most of the first early Christians were Jewish. Worship was what differentiated God from not God. If you were a Jew, good Jewish monotheist, you worshipped God, and you didn't worship anything else. So now we have the question of what convinced a bunch of Jews to turn around and start worshipping Jesus. There's only really 2 conclusions we could draw, I said to Shabir. We either have to conclude that Jesus was the most useless religious teacher in history. He was absolutely, totally, a total utter disaster because he didn't want people to worship him, but he somehow failed to communicate that, and everybody did. I said to Shabir, better, presumably, if Jesus never come, actually, the disaster, 2 billion Christians worshipping him, if he hadn't turned up, they'd be following Islam, right? Or Jesus did teach in word and action and saying that he was divine. Now, I think it's the latter, and there are dozens of examples, and I gave just a few on that night. There's a wonderful book, actually, called Putting Jesus in His Place by Ed Bowman and I forget his co-author, which goes through a lot of this material. But the pieces I point to in the book, and I used that night with Shabir, You'll be familiar with all of this. Mark chapter 2, and Jesus heals the paralytic. And of course, the religious leaders go nuts. Forgives the sins of the paralytic. And the religious leaders go nuts. How can you forgive sin? And then Jesus, I love it, with a twinkle in his eye, and I think a grin in his face, goes, I'll tell you what, what's easier, to forgive sins or to heal the guy? I'll heal the guy to prove I can do this. And of course, they start conspiring to crucify him at that point because he's put himself on a par with God. In fact, a chapter on in Mark, we find the whole debate with the Pharisees about the Sabbath. The disciples are wandering through the cornfield, picking grain on the Sabbath. The Pharisees have a go at Jesus. Jesus turns around and goes, hey, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath, mate. And to go, what's interesting, of course, in Judaism, the Sabbath was one of the central religious symbols, along with the temple and the Torah, that were at the heart of the Jewish faith. Jewish people believed that the Sabbath was divine time set up by God in the very moment of creation when he brought reality into being. It was sacred time. And so Jesus, as one scholar put it, is literally looking at the Pharisees and going, I'm the Lord of space and time. And it's interesting, Sabbath becomes another key plank in the desire to get Jesus crucified. A little bit further on, we come to the Sermon on the Mount. Later in Matthew's Gospel, Mark's and Luke's Gospel. And Jesus there in the Sermon on the Mount famously quotes the Old Testament on regular occasions, says, you have heard that it was said, quotes the Old Testament, and then replaces it, supersedes it with his own teaching. And again, I said to Shabir, how would you, or how would any Muslim in the audience feel if you went to mosque on Friday and the Imam was to read from the Quran and then say, well, that's the Quran. And you've heard that it was said, but I say to you, would you go, that's all right? Or would you be screaming that the guy had committed blasphemy? And you could sort of see from the look on Shabir's face that he got the point. And then lastly, there are several other examples if we have time, but where I came into land, and I come into land with Muslims all the time, is the Son of Man title for Jesus, which is Jesus' favorite title for himself. It's only ever found on the lips of Jesus in the Gospels, and even the most liberal New Testament scholars would recognize that seemed to be a title Jesus liked for himself. And of course, it comes from Daniel chapter 7 in the Old Testament, where one like a son of man is enthroned in heaven beside Yahweh, and was by the first century in much of Judaism was considered to be some kind of divine title, a divine figure. Jesus uses it all the time for himself, most famously before Caiaphas the high priest. When Jesus was on trial for his life, Caiaphas says to him, are you the Son of God? Are you the Son of the Most High? And if Jesus had wanted to deny that, a simple no would have sufficed, but he doesn't. He quotes Daniel chapter 7. You will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven. And of course, Caiaphas rends his robes and has Jesus sentenced to death. And I remember saying to Shabir in Toronto, that was at Shabir rather at that point in the dialogue, he said, well, I think Caiaphas just misunderstood Jesus. And I remember saying to Shabir, I said, hang on, Shabir, let me get this straight for a moment. Imagine you're Jesus. You're on trial for your life. You are being accused of blasphemy. And the high priest is asked, do you think you're the Son of the Most High God? Get the answer wrong and you are dead. What are you going to say? Are you going to say a categorical, no, I really aren't? Or are you going to start freaking quoting Daniel 7 at the high priest? And it was great because the audience were laughing at that point. I said, look, either Jesus was a raving lunatic, quite frankly, a candidate for a room with, rubber walls and one of those nice jackets with the handy sleeves that strap up at the back, or else he knew exactly who he was and was willing to admit it even when it led to death. And so what I do, Cliff, all of those pieces of evidence go together, and those claims of Jesus explain why the first Christians then, when Jesus was crucified, if he'd stayed dead, we'd have had a dead blasphemer. When God raised him from the dead, the first Christians took that as a divine stamp of approval on everything that Jesus said, and that's when worship of Jesus kicks off. So it's a beautiful explanation of the ministry of Jesus, the claims, the teaching, and the pattern we see there in the New Testament, and it has the resurrection at the heart of it. And it was interesting in Toronto, I have to say, Shabir sort of didn't really know what to do with it. He insists on, little annoying proof texts, where he could find a verse where, hang on, doesn't here Jesus deny divinity? And but he missed the big picture. So anyway, we go into detail on that in chapter 8 of the new book. I hope that helps. Sorry, long answer. I love this stuff. It's just so exciting. Because I think often the serious point here is I think Christians are often looking for proof texts. We get bounced by our Muslim friends into trying to find some magical proof text. Go for the big picture. Always go for the big picture of Scripture, because it's much, much more powerful and much more exciting. And as Raymond Brown, who was a liberal, left-leaning New Testament scholar, said even he said I see the divinity of Jesus on every page of the New Testament. Every page, it's there when you start reading it through that kind of Jewish lens.
Just as we enter the fourth quarter here, there's so many different topics we'd love to talk to you about, Andy. And thank you so much for covering so many here. It's like the fire hose here. Yeah, we're putting you really on the hot seat. But we recently had a buddy on, Eric Metaxas, and he wrote a book on heroes. I love that one of your recent books on heroes, that you picked Tim Keller. Why did you include Tim Keller? You know Tim pretty well, and he's an hour from us. Obviously, sadly, he recently was re-diagnosed with cancer. But how come you headed in that direction? I mean, he's an unbelievable guy. What are your thoughts there?
Well, the answer may be slightly more disappointing and less exciting than you were hoping. So the backstory to that book, it's about 4 years ago, it came out now. And I wrote it because I was wanting to experiment with ebooks. So I'm a bit of a techie, and I thought, I just want to see how hard it is to do your own ebook. Because if you can do those as an author, you can do little minor projects that no publisher is going to publish. And I picked that because during my time when I was full-time with Ravi Zacharias Ministries, every year at our annual summer schools, for some reason, I'd landed, being given a historical topic as well as all the usual apologetic stuff. So I don't know how this began. I think it started out with John Newton, then they gave me Wilberforce, and they gave me Leslie Newbigin, and then finally one year they gave me Keller. And so when I sat down to write that book, I just thought, all I'll do is I'll take these 5 lectures I've already done and turn them into book form. But the reason I love Keller, I think actually, to be fair, I'm being slightly cheeky. I think when they asked me to do my 5th one, they said, who would you like to do? I said, can I do Keller? And the reason for it was this, Stuart. Like many of us, I've loved Tim's stuff. I mean, I've got shelves full of Tim's kind of books. One of my colleagues at RZIM and I used to joke that we could sort of spout Keller stuff in our sleep. We were doing it. But I love his material. Huge influence on me as a young thinker. And also I love not his apologetic book. I love a lot of his stuff on his books on scripture. My favorite book is the Prodigal God, because he does such a beautiful job with Luke 15 and popularizes a lot of Ken Bailey's stuff. And I've been a fan of Ken for years. So I thought I'd do Keller. And I thought what was interesting is lots of people read his stuff but don't dig into his own story. So I just went chasing down every interview he'd given on his backstory and how he does what he does. Because one of my hopes in the book on heroes was for readers to sort of not just be inspired by those lives, but also to go, okay, what made them tick? What was the method? How did they do what they do? What were their spiritual secrets? And in case someone like Keller or Lewis, what were their apologetic kind of secrets? For C.S. Lewis, I think it was the imagination. We often miss that. As Christians, we get all into our apologetic arguments, our biblical stuff, but we forget the power of the imagination. I think Lewis got that. But then Keller, I think, firstly, I was fascinated by his own journey to faith, because he almost lost his almost nominal Christian faith as a student. If you read interviews with him, he was pretty much the liberal end, actually, and had this sort of great encounter with God. But then I think just his ability to really take people's questions seriously, to really try and understand the culture, and then really to try. And the other thing I think I admire in him is the ability to weave the apologetics into the preaching. Sometimes I think I get nervous that apologetics and theology get separated. You have people who are great apologists, you have people who are great theologians, people who are great preachers. I think Tim has done this beautiful job of putting it all together, and just does it very, very well. And I guess as someone who writes, I just admire immensely his ability to write and think. So it was great fun doing those 5. And of course the other ones in there. I mean, John Newton I wanted to do because Newton often gets overlooked. Everyone goes for Wilberforce. Hey, slave trade, Wilberforce, wow! And we forget the fact that without John Newton, we wouldn't have a Wilberforce. Because Wilberforce, when he became a Christian, was thinking of leaving politics and becoming a pastor. As John Newton was like, no, God has called you, mate, and put you into politics for a reason. You stay right there. And then Leslie Newbigin, that Anglican missionary, who is not nearly as widely known as I think he should be. He was just utterly brilliant, and in fact, so much of what those of us who enjoy apologetics sort of take for granted in terms of engaging culture and big ideas. We can all quote Ravi and Bill Craig and Holly Ordway and all these kind of folks, but it all goes back. A lot of it goes back to Newbigin, who figured all this stuff out, particularly understanding culture. When he came out from India and suddenly realized that the West had gone all postmodern and rest all of that. So no, I really enjoyed reading it. My one apology for people who listen to this and want to go digging out, I'm very conscious that my 5 heroes I stuck in there are blokes. People have said, "Oh, where are the women?" I'm like, I'm so sorry. It was never an intention to design this as a set. Those were 5 lectures given over about 8 years. And if I was going to do that as a book project now, there are other people I would put into there. And actually, one of the fun things, having a 7-year-old and 5-year-old in the house, we're discovering the power of Christian biography. And there's a wonderful husband and wife writing team whose name's temporarily escaped me, who work for YWAM, Youth with a Mission. They've written sort of 100 different Christian biographies on men and women of faith down through the ages. And it's fantastic getting those into its kids. And so for Christians listening to this, especially if you've got children, get your kids onto biography. It's exciting to see what God has done through men and women down through the ages. So yeah, I hope to go back and revisit that, do it properly at some point, include some women, also include some non-Westerners as well. There's like one of my heroes is an African theologian called Lamin Sana, who died about a year ago, who wrote a brilliant book called Whose Religion is Christianity? Absolutely brilliant take on the idea that Christianity is purely a Western religion from this brilliant African thinker. There are heroes everywhere. And I think as Christians, we can make 2 mistakes with heroes. We can either put them on a pedestal, or we just get all sort of spiritual and go, I just need Jesus. But actually, one of my favorite passages in Scripture is that great cloud of witnesses passage in Hebrews 12. That idea that there's all those men and women of faith down through the ages kind of rooting for us, cheering us on. And that's one of the great resources that God has given us. And it's great to point some of them out and put people towards them.
That's great. Okay, so we have a few people in the chat here who have already bought your ebook. So we've been very impressed here by your responses.
Thank you very much.
Let's see here, Andy, just as we wrap up here, do you mind giving us a 30 to 60 second answers to some questions that are coming in here?
Yeah, do best. I've got maybe 10 minutes, so we could, I get a 5 past 9 in the UK, so we could try short answers. Notice I don't really do short answers, and we don't do that in England. We just keep talking because we think it makes us sound educated. But I'll do my best.
That's you, right? Oh, man. Okay, here we go. First one. Do you believe God still gives dreams, visions, or prophecies to believers, or do you believe those have stopped nowadays?
I absolutely believe they do. I'll give you a very quick answer as to why. I never used to. I grew up in a church tradition where we didn't believe in that. And when I began reaching out to Muslims, it wasn't long before I met my first former Muslim whose testimony involved the fact that God, Jesus had appeared to them in a dream. And the first time I heard that, I wrote them off as being slightly strange because that wasn't what happened in my tradition. I have since met hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. So purely on the fact that's a massive part of the testimony of many Muslims. Nabil Qureshi's book, Seeking Allah, Finding Jesus, is a good one for that. Or talked about, not just talking about blokes. So Bilquis Sheikh wrote a very famous book called I Dared to Call Him Father. She was a high-ranking Pakistani Muslim who had a tremendous conversion experience, and dreams were at the heart of it. So yes, I do believe God still works that way today.
That's great. Solid answer. Okay, here we go. Second one. Should Catholic and Orthodox beliefs be brushed aside as they believe in a lot of non-biblical stuff, so traditions?
No is a simple answer, but let me flesh that out a little bit. One of my concerns, particularly those of us who are evangelical Protestants, is it is very easy to look at some of what our Catholic friends and Orthodox friends believe and go, oh my good grief, and throw the whole thing out. Problem is, if you do that, you do end up in the situation where you are basically saying that for 13 or 1400 years of history, there was no church. Because once the Catholic Church gets going, and we've then got to wait to the 1500s to get to the Protestants. As one of my church history profs said, you can sort of try and leap through history, finding sort of proto-Protestant groups for 1500 years. It looks a bit weird. I'd far rather take the line, and I do when I meet Catholic friends, rather than going, oh, well, hang on a minute, let me tell you what I think is wrong. I prefer to lead with, tell me about you and Jesus, tell me about your faith in Christ. And I've had some tremendous conversations over the years. In fact, I remember actually, this links into the previous question, in my early 20s, meeting one of the most charismatic, spirit-filled, Jesus-loving people I've ever met. And he was a Catholic monk who lived in this sort of small retreat centre in the north of England. And I remember literally praying sort of words to the effect of, Lord, help me understand this, because he cannot be a Christian. He's a Catholic. And I remember God saying to me, I felt the Lord very clearly saying, don't you dare delegates yourself to decide who or who isn't a Christian. He is a lover and follower of me. And my takeaway from that is all of us have different degrees of crazy baggage in our theology. Yeah, there is some crazy stuff around parts of the Catholic Church. Do not get me wrong, and I apologize if I've offended any Catholics, but I would defend that if you were having a coffee together. But the question is, how much crazy baggage can really prevent the grace of Christ operating? So if somebody has bowed the knee, surrendered to Christ, put their trust in him, I think there's still room for all kinds of mess that the Lord has to deal with. I've got some crazy theological ideas. I'm sure I'll get to heaven and God will go, you believe what? I think, is Christ central is the key. Let's have that conversation with Catholic friends. That de-weaponizes it a bit. And if Christ isn't central, preach Christ to them, because that's ultimately what wins somebody, not doctrine.
Last Muslim question here.
Well,
is
Muslim
Muhammad
question.
is Muhammad in the Bible? And Namus, this is one we get on college campuses actually. When I bring up, I think it's Namus, when Muhammad was getting his prophecy at the cave, was he trying to throw himself off a cliff and commit suicide? Sorry, we got a little lawnmower here in the background.
Oh, that's great. I thought that was like some soundtrack, and it's not. It's a lawnmower. Right, two questions in mind there. Let's start with the Bible one. No, Muhammad is not in the Bible. Many Muslims believe that he is, though. The reason being that the Quran has elusive reference to the unlettered prophet, which can mean the prophet who can't read or write, depending how you interpret it, who is mentioned in the form of scriptures. I think that's chapter 7, verse 157 of the Quran from memory, but it's late here. And historically, Muslim theologians took that to mean, Muhammad is prophesied in the Bible. And early Muslims spent their days combing through the Bible, trying to find all kinds of references. And boy, there are some really obscure ones. The most common one is the passage in John where Jesus talks about sending another comforter to be with the disciples when he leaves. The Greek word there, parakletos, another comforter, another counselor. And Muslims, for a long time, many Muslims have tried to claim that promise in John's gospel actually refers to Muhammad. The answer to that claim is simply to read the text around that verse, and you'll see Jesus fills out the role of that comforter. He will point the disciples to Jesus. He will live within them, and so on and so forth. And I often say to Muslims, in what way did Muhammad live inside the disciples in the first century, and so on and so forth. So that's the way to deal with that. And actually, quite frankly, I love it when Muslims raise that, because you can use it for a Bible study. You can say, well, let's open that passage of the Bible and let's read the entire chapter. Let's not just read the verse, let's read the chapter. And anything to get Muslims reading scripture is a good thing. But that's where that idea comes from. And then the throwing off a cliff thing, yes, it's very interesting. When you read the Hadith and the biographical traditions about Muhammad, it does seem, according to the Islamic sources themselves, so the story goes that when Muhammad is in that cave on Mount Hira overlooking Mecca and has the experience of the angel Gabriel. When I describe it that way, by the way, I'm not assigning it historical worth. I'm just describing the stories to you. It's quite a disturbing experience. Muhammad doesn't go, hooray, I'm a prophet. He actually is filled with terror. And in some of the accounts, Muhammad is so filled with terror, he then walks up to the mountain and is about to throw himself off the cliff and commit suicide because he thinks he's lost all of his mental faculties. And Gabriel again appears to him to reassure him. My other favorite version of that story, though, some of the stories go on from there. And there's one tradition in some of the early Islamic sources that then has Muhammad goes home to his wife Khadija, and she tells him what has happened and how upset he is. He's not sure whether this is a good spirit or a bad spirit that has appeared to him. And so Khadija's solution to this is utterly brilliant in one or two of the texts. She says, well, what we'll do next time this spirit appears to you, tell me, and I'll come into the room and I'll disrobe. I'll remove all my clothes. Because if it is a good spirit, a chaste spirit, it will then go back up to heaven. If it's an immoral spirit, if it's an evil spirit, if it's a jinn, it'll hang around. So I love the test of prophecy by nakedness. So and according to another tradition, actually, Muhammad then sits on her knee and waits for Gabriel to come. And the angel comes, and Khadija sort of drops the dressing gown, and the angel scoots out the window and disappears, from which they conclude it's a good spirit, and Muhammad should listen to it. And there are lots of stories around that kind of theme there in the early Islamic sources, which I find absolutely fascinating, because a huge contrast, I think, with the biblical prophets. And I often like to make that point to Muslims. It's interesting. Yeah, absolutely. There are biblical prophets who have great questions. Look at Moses, for example. Moses doubts his own ability to speak, and God graciously gives him Aaron. Elijah, after that great confrontation on Mount Carmel with the prophets of Baal, and so forth, is then so exhausted. I think he's in despair. I'm the only one in Israel, and God comforts him. But I can't think of a biblical example of somebody wanting to commit suicide or asking their wife to strip naked or any of those kind of things. In other words, sort of when Yahweh shows up, it's pretty clear it's God showing up. And this brings us full circle back to the Muslim Christian worship the same God, because what's interesting, the God of the Bible is a God who can be known. And when he appeared and spoke to each of those prophets in the Old Testament, he made clear who he was. I love that beautiful scene at the burning bush in Exodus 3, where God reveals his own personal name to Moses. I mean, we miss what an astounding scene that is. The God of the universe saying to Moses, here's my name, Yahweh, I am. By contrast, Muhammad, the founder of Islam, God never bothers to show up. It's always Gabriel. God always sends a delegate. So this is, the Quran is supposed to be the final revelation to humankind, but Allah simply is busy. Maybe he's traveling, maybe he's sleeping. Shout louder, as Elijah would have said. And the best that Muhammad gets is some angelic experience. What a contrast with the God of the Bible, who shows up consistently, most clearly, in the person of Jesus. And so in Allah we have a distant God. In Yahweh we have a God who's very, very close and can be known, and a God who gave his life, for you and I, for our atheist friends, for our Muslim friends. And what a privilege we have to share that news with those who come across our path. That was not a short answer. I am sorry. I started preaching.
That was fantastic. The Lawnmower soundtrack is still in the back, so if anybody wants to buy that, we'll put that in the link too.
Absolutely.
But Andy, this was fantastic. We're going to put all of his books in the links. We got some questions. Do you have a YouTube channel?
Do I have a YouTube channel? I have a small one. If people look up the Solas website, is the best thing to do. So that's solas-cpc.org. I'll put that into the chat actually, because look, I'll show I know how to use StreamYard. If you go to solas.cpc.org, there's links there to our various channels. We don't use YouTube as much as we should. Funnily enough, we use Facebook a lot more. All of our videos we stick on our kind of website and stuff. So encourage listeners to check that out. All of our stuff is free. My books obviously aren't, but there's vast amounts of essays and articles and videos and so forth. So please, feel free to use it. And it's been really enjoyed this evening, fellas. We'll have to do this again. I can't go to midnight your time. That would be like 4 a.m. for me or something ludicrous. But very happy to do this again sometime. I've enjoyed this tremendously.
We would love that.
Thank you so much, Andy.
If you enjoyed your time with us, or if you're a first timer, hit the subscribe button, hit that bell so you know when the next one's coming up. We have Susan Blackmore on Thursday, who's an atheist. So that'll be a very different conversation. And I hope you guys can join us then. Thanks again, Andy.
Thank you, Andy.
Been great. Take care, guys.
You too.